Welcome to another episode of Brushstrokes of Being. Today I want to discuss the following question and its implications. What happens to a society when it stops giving artists and musicians time to grow or takes away the opportunities to learn artistic skills? Music and art training does not begin when young people decide they want to become musicians or artists. It begins much earlier. In school, when teachers introduce them to something that sparks their imagination and inspires a dream to pursue. Apart from that, music and art education in schools offers multiple benefits. Learning to play an instrument and read music trains the brain for complexity. Research in neuroscience and education has repeatedly found associations between sustained musical training and improvements in auditory processing, attention, memory, and executive functions. Learning an instrument requires a child to coordinate listening, movement, timing, emotional expression, and concentration simultaneously. That does not mean every child who learns the piano automatically becomes better at mathematics. The relationship is more subtle. Music develops capacities that support learning: sustained attention, pattern recognition, discipline, working memory, collaboration, self-correction. And these are transferable skills. Visual art develops observation and flexible thinking. Yet art education is often reduced to simply being creative. Observational drawing, for example, trains perception. Done well, it teaches a child to slow down, compare, notice relationships, and question assumptions. They discover that a first impression is not always the truth. Not every child thrives in purely verbal or analytical environments. Music and art offer different forms of intelligence and expression. When these are removed from education, the pathways through which children discover competence and confidence become narrower. So the danger is not only that we lose future professional artists or musicians, the much greater loss is that children lose opportunities to develop attention, sensitivity, curiosity, and patience. When we remove music and art from children's lives, we are really saving time? Or are we taking away the very practices that help them learn how to think? Every child deserves access to the disciplines that help them become more fully human. The pianist João Pires has long expressed deep concern that modern higher music education and the classical music industry leave young musicians with little time to grow, mature, and discover their own musical identities. She argues that teaching students to compete constantly and aggressively market themselves causes them to forget the original reason they fell in love with music as children. She believes that modern obsession with international piano competitions can be deeply damaging, encouraging a superficial focus on winning rather than authentic artistic exploration. I believe we are witnessing something very similar in visual art. It is the erasure of slower study. Instead of asking, can this child observe? Can this student sustain attention? Has this painter developed judgement? We increasingly ask, can they produce something quickly? Can they explain their concept? Can they market themselves? Is it recognizable? You could almost summarize the shift like this: the means become the end. When we admire Rembrandt, for instance, we are not supposed to think, look how cleverly he handled lead white. When we hear a great performance of Schubert, we are not supposed to think, what extraordinary finger technique. We are meant to encounter something beyond the technique itself. That reminds me of something that has been attributed to the great cellist Pablo Casals. Technique must be so completely absorbed into your being that it disappears. It reminds me of what I usually said and say still to my students. First you have to know, then you can let go. Mastery is not the destination. It is what makes genuine expression possible. Performance asks, what can I demonstrate? Presence asks, what truth can I reveal? Those are not opposing ideas. Great artists need both. But if a culture increasingly rewards demonstration over revelation, it changes not only how art is made, but what people come to believe art is for. Classical training has become less valued in many areas of society, but that does not necessarily mean it is less valuable. Those are two very different claims. A classical education in music or in drawing and painting is built on the idea that foundations matter. You do not skip scales because you want to play a concerto. You do not skip observational drawing because you want to paint expressive portraits. The discipline exists to develop capacities that remain with you long after the exercises themselves. Today, there is often a preference for immediacy. Can I play this song in a week? Can I paint a realistic portrait in a weekend? And even, can AI do this for me? The focus shifts from formation to performance, from mastery to immediate results. Yet, if you look at the world's finest musicians, dancers, architects, or painters, classical training remains deeply respected. They know it is not about becoming rigid. It is about acquiring a language. Once you possess that language, you can finally speak with your own voice, provided you are given the time to develop it. And perhaps we have misunderstood what classical really means. It does not mean old-fashioned. It means that generations have discovered certain methods of learning because they reliably cultivate excellence. In other words, training teaches you how to do something. Education asks who you become in the process. These disciplines cultivate enduring human capacities that remain relevant regardless of the era. Art and music are not an escape from life. They are ways of paying attention to life. Every brushstroke asks us to see more carefully. Every musical phrase asks us to listen more deeply. But in a world that rewards speed and certainty, perhaps the greatest act of resistance is simply this: to look, to listen, and to allow ourselves and others the time to grow. Because when a society loses its capacity for careful observation, deep listening, and patient cultivation, it does not simply produce fewer artists. It gradually forgets how to pay attention to itself.